So the title is Cursivity, and I'm going to focus on that particularly in the second part, partly because, as Mark was just saying, there has been a tendency to focus on the image, the result, at least in the early English paleography. But when we're looking at cursive script, especially, that becomes more problematic. I think we've been forced more and more to look at other ways in trying to model that. But I am going to take as an example one particular case of the relationship between the more cursive and the more majuscule script, where we can identify, we think, quite precise circumstances that led to that, which weren't necessarily the typical ones. So to start off very quickly, in terms of learning and scribal practice and so on, there are a few interesting hints, and this is picking up a little bit what Jean-Luc was talking about yesterday, of these what tend to be catalogued as scribbles and more or less ignored in manuscripts. Right like this, there are actually half a dozen or more manuscripts with this written somewhere. Does that mean right like this script, this style? Is it just a pen trail? Who knows? It's very difficult to say. This is particularly unusual because in the middle of other texts, what it's doing is hard to say. And there's this other odd phrase which looks like some sort of educational context, maybe, but again, very difficult to know what's going on. This has been noticed because it's in Old English and therefore it's been catalogued. But in the flyleaves of manuscripts, there are a lot of what are just catalogued as pen trials, but are very, very much like what Jean-Luc was showing yesterday. So a lot of alphabets, a lot of odd words. There's frater fratrem written there. And not a lot, but a number where the same text is written by two different scribes, clearly one more expert and one much less so. And as far as I know, I gave a talk on this about 10 years ago, I never published it, but as far as I know, I'm the only person who suggested that this does look to me like some sort of training or practice or something, even though the received view is that students were learning on wax tablets and not wasting parchment and so on. Again, this has been systematically done, but I have a dozen or so different examples like that, where the same text is being copied 2 or more times by different people in different circumstances. But again, it's very circumstantial. It's very hard to know what to do about this. Other cases, there are clearly pen trials. In fact, that's probatio penne is quite often literally what they write. How do we distinguish between one or the other is difficult to say. In terms of the circumstances of writing, again, we have this image of sitting in a scriptorium with the desk and so on. And of course, if you're in Northern England, you're not so lucky to have natural light a large part of the year and to be able to sit outside and so on. I can attest to that. But there are, again, hints of other circumstances. And one well-known case is this colophon. Alfred the Provost wrote these 4 collects at Oakley to the south of Woodyates. So this is something like 450 kilometers from his home, if you like, before Tiers see the bishop in his tent. So hinting that at least in some cases, they're not sitting there at their nice desk and so on and so forth. It's mostly glossing, and we know this is the same person, by the way, who glossed the very famous Lindisfarne Gospels. And it is a slightly unusual script, particularly for this period. Is that because he was sitting in his tent and writing differently? Is that because it's pretty much the only localizable example of script from Northern England from this period? Probably more likely. Again, these hints, what we can do with that is unfortunately not very clear, but at least there are cases where clearly they're not sitting in these ideal circumstances. And again, there's been very little discussion in this context, but the charters in particular, royal court was moving around, even some of the bishops and others writing in different personal circumstances there. But the one I want to focus on, and looking more at the cursivity, is a specific case from a bit earlier. So the first couple I showed were late 11th century. This is a bit earlier, 10th century. But from England and Ireland up until about the mid-9th century, we have the sort of famous stereotypical, if you like, insular script, which is very much what you normally think about if you think of so-called Irish majuscule and so on. In fact, we saw some on Mark's slide earlier. This is the sort of archetypal, typical, what, by the way, tends to be called majuscule, and this comes back to Mark's discussion earlier. What does that even mean? It is sort of two-line, and so on and so forth. And there is this, what has been identified as the insular script system, and taking absolutely all the caveats that Mark raised earlier, there does nevertheless seem to be conscious use of different types of script in the same manuscript for different purposes. So we have this at the top, if you like, the insular, the so-called majuscule, half uncial, and at the bottom, if you like, what officially is called current minuscule, clearly much more cursive in production and form and so on. Although even then, as Mark said, how do you define cursivity exactly? This is something I'll come back to later. The production of the letters, there's very little pen left, but the number of ligatures is not enormous. It could be much better. There is some modification of the ductus, particularly the E here going up in this direction. But generally speaking, the ductus is the same. It's simply a question of pen lift and rapidity and so forth. And then perhaps more typical in the middle, what we call insular set minuscule, although again, in what respect there are plenty of ligatures and elements of cursivity, even if the script is relatively set in terms of serifs and pen lift and so on and so forth there. But this is the sort of insular system, the writing that was produced in England and Ireland, or Britain more or less, and Ireland up until more or less the middle of the 9th century. But in the middle of this, again, coming very specifically from Northern England and probably just from one monastery in particular, you suddenly get something very different. And here, clearly, sort of, Tansiel, obviously, is very clearly directly Roman influenced. And in these particular circumstances, we think, explain relatively easily, because this is a period in which it's a new foundation. It's a foundation where we know they identified as being very much Roman, if you like. There are all the debates about the dating of Easter and the tonsure and so on, the so-called Irish and so-called Roman practice. And so the assumption, which seems well-founded, is that this was part of their identity, if you like, to writing this very formal and specifically Roman, as opposed to what we would call insular script. But this doesn't actually last very long. In fact, it's only a half century or even less before they start going back, if you like, to the insular script. And this then raises the question, why, what's going on, and what are the particular circumstances? And this is coming back a bit more to the theme of the conference, that the very specific circumstances of this monastery, it has been suggested, explain the reasons why they stopped producing manuscripts in this high-level uncial script and went towards something more cursive, more informal. Even though they clearly still knew the uncial, and there's no question of that, but they're no longer using it for the main script, and are in fact going back to something much closer to the insular system of the different grades, different types of script that were being produced together. Now, again, the idea of the insular system is it's very much based on the type of text and not the particular circumstances, whereas here this doesn't seem to apply anymore in the sense that presumably they're not writing their shopping list or whatever in uncial, we don't know, but at least the identifiable manuscripts seem to be written that way. Of course, there's some circularity here. If they were writing in insular and there was no other evidence, would we know that? And there has been some discussion there as well. But the proposal comes primarily from Malcolm Parkes, who identified in the correspondence from this era at the time again, specific circumstances, which he proposed to explain this difference. And there are two factors here. One is this is the home monastery of Bede, and Bede, you may know, is a very, very prolific writer. He's still very well known, and his manuscripts are now all over Europe. And there are all these letters of people writing to the monastery saying, can we have copies of your books, please? We know this, we want more material. I beg you copy and send me some treatises from the work of the teacher Bede. We request that you kindly have copies, of course, in the translation. And the argument is that this is then putting pressure for more rapid production and more circulation of the manuscripts. And on the other hand, we also have, at least in some cases, the response. And going back to climatic conditions, this does seem to have been relevant here. The conditions of the past winter oppressed us very horribly with cold and ice, long spread storms and rain. So the scribe was hindered from producing a great number of books. I would imagine the question of light, again, is very much relevant here. So yes, this is a bit speculative to some extent, but even if we live, that combination of the very high demand, this is the argument at least, and the particular climatic conditions at the time, the argument is that they're no longer able to maintain this very slow, high-grade Roman script and degrading, if you like, to something more like this. So this is Parkes' argument. The growing demand is the principal reason why there's this change, this cursivity, if you like, for manuscripts produced. But his argument is also that there is this so-called notion of decorum, which was then imported into, if you like, the more cursive script. So he talks about specifically distinctly disciplined, minuscule cursive in a sense, that betrays the influence of majuscule, which must lie behind the evolution of the minuscule. Now, I would suggest that's probably a bit strong and probably a bit too much linked directly to this. And the argument afterwards is that this so-called phase 2 minuscule then spreads from there. And we have this sort of upgrading and increased discipline of cursive script throughout perhaps the rest of England and perhaps Ireland as well. And again, there are all sorts of problems and preconceptions about Irish versus English practice and so on. But just argue at least that there was this sort of impact on the daily practice of the two tensions between trying to be more formal as a result of the Roman influence and trying to be more rapid as demand for book production and so on increased throughout. There does seem to be some argument for that. And again, this is the one example, and another case here, which is a bit later, of, again, a more, presumably more rapid, this is the so-called type 2B study by Julia Crick and others. And again, I use those terms, but I fully agree that these typologies are useful only to a certain point. So various possible cases where we can identify hints of the specific circumstances of production, trying to pin that down, and in particular, trying to identify the relationships between these different scripts and circumstances is much more challenging. And as many of you also know, one of the big questions for me for a long time is precisely how to describe more formally paleography in general in a digital form. And well, as Mark said as well, I think it is important, and as these cases show, to be able to specify the relationship between these more cursive forms and these practices and the more formal ones. If it is true that the cursive minuscule from Weymouth Jarrow is directly related to the majuscule forms, how do we describe that relationship formally? What do we do with that? To mention what is cursivity, how can we define it and produce it and specify it? And there have been many discussions, as Mark mentioned, and this has been the subject of my seminar at the Ecole last year. These are some very sort of rough ideas at the moment. I partly agree with Mark on the suggestion that we have to look at the relationship and not the individual letters. But I would suggest, in fact, there are two different types of cursivity, if you like. There is the question of cursive script and also the question of cursive form. And I think perhaps distinguishing those is useful, as well as, we sort of partly have it here, but cursive production in cursive result, if you like. So something might look very cursive without necessarily being produced in a cursive manner, or vice versa, which again, Mark hinted at earlier. And I sort of wonder about vocabulary and accent as being helpful in that phase, in that sense, and after the question of grade and so on and so forth. But what is clear, and I think it's very much the subject of these few days, is this question of modelling the production versus modelling the result. It's true, particularly in the context of English paleography, I think it's fair to say that we have focused on the result rather than the production, and even more so on the digital. So I couldn't resist putting something about the digital, and this is looking forward a bit to tomorrow. But there's no question that if you look at work I've done and others, this is clearly the image of the result and not the production. And that I don't have any particular problem with that. Any approach has to focus on one aspect, but of course that is a limitation. And of course that makes treating cursive script very, very difficult. This has been recognized for a long time. Just quickly say, in terms of formally describing what we're doing here, this is the argument, I was talking about this in Basel 5 or so years ago, that we have a letter which has the visual component in our mind's eye, if you like, that represents a linguistic element of some sort, and that is inferred by us from some sort of mark on a surface through the ink and so on. But Dominique, among others, pointed out that, of course, this is only one aspect, doesn't consider production. And I think he's right, too, that this is not a simple modification. This is really something entirely different to capture that and try to put that into use. So I'm running out of time, as usual, but just to say there was a workshop in Oxford earlier this year on this subject. Sainoa Castro looking at questions like trying to break up different aspects of cursivity and grade and fluency and so on as well. There's been some very interesting study. I think this is not very well known, but modeling the strokes and the trajectories and then modifying what happens if you accelerate more or if you turn less and so on. How does that change the script, the images that result? And again, cases of trying to map out the strokes and so on, which, by the way, is almost identical to the model used by tablets, which we'll see tomorrow. So to round off very quickly, an alternative model that we've been looking at is suggesting that there is the act of writing. So not writing as a result, but writing as an act, part of which involves movements of different traces, which then result in the strokes, the human-made features, the lines, which then can be interpreted as different letters. I think there is a big problem here about interpretation. As Mark was saying, do we interpret the letter? Well, yes and no. We also interpret the stroke and the form and so on. So is it actually right to focus on the graph as the feature, or is it the stroke, or is it some combination? I think probably all of these. And I think there's another problem which we really haven't addressed, which is the allograph in the sense of the image in the mind's eye. But whose mind? Is the image in the writer's mind the same as the image in the reader's mind, or is in the paleographer's mind? And I'm beginning to think more and more that this is important, actually, particularly in a digital case. And what are we really looking at when we create our abstract models? Is it us? Is it the writer? How does that fit together? And in fact, this struck me as being very close to the classical model of communication, which is perhaps no coincidence. Writing is communication, of signal and noise and so on. and then potentially identifying different types of noise or influence or impact on the different elements as the model to better take into account all the things that we've been discussing and we'll discuss tomorrow. But again, I hope to leave at least a couple of minutes for questions. I know there's been bits and pieces sort of in different directions, but I hope there are at least some ideas that might be interesting to discuss now or after. So we'll stop there, but thank you very much.
Thank you.